Welcome, friends, to another episode of Cinematic Realms. And I'm one of your hosts, John Webster, and with me, as always, is my co-host. Introduce yourself, Jared.
My name is Jared Kozel, and yes, I am the trusty co-pilot on the good ship Cinematic Realms.
And today we're joined by someone who has been probably itching to do this stream with with me for a long while. But Laura, we've been together since the beginning. I always say that even though it's maybe a little disingenuous because it makes it very self-centered on us, but I always feel like we're the beginning of the Here Be Dragons crew, because we didn't start Here Be Dragons, but we were there at the beginning of our formation of our little group, all the way back in, what was it, 2017?
2016.
2016. We met in 2017, but in person. But we were talking in 2016, back in the days of when we were on the Game of Thrones Small Council. Yeah, God, it's been a wonderful journey, for sure. And we have you on today. We also meant to have our good friend Trish on the stream as well, but she's unable to make it today. We miss her. We know that she really wanted to talk about this too, but just have to keep her in our thoughts as we, discuss this incredible movie. We're talking about The Witch, directed by Robert Eggers today, which Laura, you were trying to get me to watch this for quite a while, and finally I did. I guess a little while ago now. The passage of time is like, it's a concept to me that I can't keep track of, but some time ago I finally watched it. I remember I was posting updates while I was watching it, and in the Here We Dragons Slack, I was like, what the F? What am I watching? And then we did a watch party on it, which was a lot of fun. But why don't you start us off with just, when did you see this movie? And I guess, what were your thoughts regarding it? And why were you so eager to get me to watch the film?
I didn't see this in theaters when it came out. It was as it was getting closer to Oscar buzz time and the season that year, and this movie was starting to get a lot of hype for the awards that it could potentially get nominated for. So I looked into it as a movie lover, and I noticed two things that stuck out to me were Ralph and Kate's names, and just having known them from being on the Game of Thrones cast, just had me instantly just being like, I need to be all in on this. This is something that I need to immediately go see. Didn't really have any context for who Anya was at that point in time, because she was just getting started. This was her first feature film. And on top of the fact that it was a horror film, and I am all about those types of movies, it just felt like, the stars were aligning, and this was something that I was going to really enjoy. So I watched it one evening, and I just remember going into work the next day and just annoying the crap out of my coworkers, none of whom who have seen it, but who just thought I was probably on some sort of like rant about it, just raving about it, saying like, you need to go see this. And everyone was just like, okay, Laura, okay. And then I've just loved it ever since. It stuck out to me too, because I think we've probably have all seen like The Crucible, which is a very sort of similar film, addressing witchcraft in 1600, 1700 New England puritanical, context. But this was just very different, and it was actually truthful and really horrific, and I just loved it. And I've been on the train for it ever since, just begging you to see it. So I'm glad you finally did.
The thing that I always think about, and it brings me so much joy, just because it allows me, and to boast about my film score I love is that time we were all in Williamsburg and you and I went out somewhere and we were doing the soundtrack guessing game and you put on the score for The Witch and I called that one without having yet seen the movie.
I was very impressed in that moment.
Because, well, when you're with this kind of story, and I kind of had a vague notion of what the movie was like, at least. There's only, like, it's a very distinctive score, so I think my mind probably went there, but I wasn't sure because I hadn't seen the movie, but it seemed like the right fit. And oh my God, like the minute this movie starts, the music just has you on edge where you're like, oh God, I'm very uncomfortable. I have to stand up.
Mm-hmm.
I rewatched the movie today and this morning, and like you'd think maybe watching it in daylight would be better, but I was just as thoroughly creeped out, and and now everything feels off today because I'm feeling very disturbed. But yeah, no, I am so completely overjoyed that you got me to watch this film, and now it's it's one of my favorite movies from certainly that year, and probably like it's I'm not a big horror fan, so I can without a doubt say this is one of my favorite horror movies. But usually it is. I'm not very much a person who likes to be scared that much, but there's so much that's thought-provoking in this movie, and it's about the atmosphere. And while there are a couple jump scares here and there, that's not really what the movie is about. It's it's very much about filling you with dread, and I don't know, even though I don't like typical horror movies, I really do love those movies that kind of set you on edge. Like Alien is a big one for me that I always, I'm a huge fan of. I think you know a bit about that, Laura.
I don't know. I don't think I've ever heard of that one.
And so this, while obviously wildly different, has that same kind of like, I'm feeling very freaked out and disturbed as I watch it. And but Jared, how about you? When did you see this movie?
So this movie came out in 2015, and it actually premiered at the Sundance Film Festival that year. And back at that time, I was still in the phase where I actually cared about reading critical reviews and advanced reviews. That time has passed, but at the time, and actually probably still, one of the critics I did enjoy reading was Drew McWeeny over at the old HitFix website, which became Uproxx, which then became nothing. But he was at the Sundance Film Festival at the time, and he posted a review of this movie by an unknown director at the time, Robert Eggers, and starring an unknown actress at the time, Anya Taylor Joy, in her feature film debut. And the only thing that I knew about it from the title was that it was a folk tale set in 1630s Puritan New England, and that it was kind of more of an atmospheric horror thriller. But then I saw that Ralph Ineson and Kate Dickie were in it. And this, as Laura mentioned, this was the era where any project that had a Game of Thrones actor in it, especially two Game of Thrones actors, especially two such good Game of Thrones actors, would get an automatic look from me. So I read the review, and as I was reading it, I became more and more intrigued because this critic, who I respected a lot, was comparing the movie to movies like The Shining, which I loved very much. And he was talking about it in these very like quiet, reverent tones of a movie that seemed like a more unconventional horror movie. even for someone who had seen many of those types of movies. And the line that stuck out to me the most when I was reading his review was one towards the end, when he had a quote that actually wound up in the trailer, where he said, quote, "Eggers manages to create a sense of mood and dread that is so suffocating at times that it feels like we're watching something genuinely transgressive, something we should not be seeing." And when I heard that, I was like, that sounds like a great premise for a movie. I'm also not the biggest horror fan in the world, but the horror movies I tend to like are the ones that focus more on atmosphere and character and kind of the sense of psychological dread and interpersonal dynamics that are unsettled. I'm basically not a fan of jump scares, is what I'm trying to say. And it sounded like this was a movie that did not rely on them. So I was very intrigued, and I kind of kept my mind open for it. And then I saw the trailer. And the trailer is one of the best trailers I think I've ever seen for a horror movie. Specifically, it starts out, it seems very like unsettling. They're speaking in this weird puritanical English, which I didn't know they would be doing. And then there's the scene where you see Thomason do the peekaboo game with the baby, and then the baby's gone. And you're just like, okay, something's happening here. And then it builds up to like the midpoint of the trailer where Caleb's approaching the witch's hut, and then it cuts. And then you start to hear Caleb's prayer where he's like, where he's praying to God to deliver him from sin. And then the prayer becomes faster and faster and faster. And it's showing even more and more and more and more unsettling images. They're just building and building and building. And your heart is racing and racing and racing. And then it cuts to pure black. And then you just hear William, Ralph Ineson's character, say very quietly, very somberly, "There's evil in the wood." And then the trailer title comes up, "The Witch." And I was like, fuck, man. This is like that's a piece of art in and of itself. So I was very keen to see the movie. Unfortunately, it was not playing where I lived, so I wasn't able to see it in theaters, but I kept it in mind until a few months later when it came out on home video. And then I made sure I was home alone. I turned all the lights down. I watched it by myself, and I loved it. It was just an astonishing feat of atmosphere and tone and thematic imagery and character. And it re-registered for me that this was this director's feature debut, and that this was the lead actress, Anya Taylor Joy's feature debut. I was just immediately like, anything that these two do at any point in the future is going to get a look from me, because dear God, what an impressive piece of work from both of them. And I felt it kind of in my core just from that I have that feeling from very few movies of this director is going places and this actress is going to be a star. And both of those have borne out in the next few years, because wow.
What has she been busy with lots of roles or something?
Oh yeah. Just a few.
Which is so funny because I think this may have been you, Laura, but I had been chided in the past about not having seen many of Anya Taylor Joy's movies yet, and I've been taking my time. I've been going, slowly through her filmography. Same thing with Robert Eggers, because I still haven't gotten to The Lighthouse yet. And on the one hand, I'm like, oh God, what's taking you so long? But on the other hand, I'm like, but I'm savoring, and I'm gonna get to it soon.
Can I just say, you can skip The Lighthouse. Personal hot take.
Oh, well,
I would push back on that, but I do think it is probably the film that is the most esoteric of what I affectionately referred to during our Northman discussion as Robert Eggers' Dark Mindfuck trilogy. The Lighthouse is kind of the Empire Strikes Back, but of that trilogy, and that it's the darkest and most unhinged of them all, but it is also the one that is probably the least narratively like straightforward. So
Well, see, that just
I
sounds
would-
like
I
I'm
would-
gonna. That just sounds
Yeah.
like I'm gonna love it, though.
yeah.
Okay, see, like I know this is not a Lighthouse stream, and I don't want to spoil it because John, you haven't seen it. But I will say, I've seen this metaphor posited, and I'm just going to throw it out here, where people have said, "Portrait of a Girl on Fire" is what happens when women can communally live together on an island, and everything is nice, and the cohabitation is there, and like the wine is flowing, and everything is just easy peasy lemon squeezy. And The Lighthouse is what happens when you seclude men on an island together. Shit hits the fan in a 180 way, and they're drinking gasoline and murdering seagulls. Sorry, Ness, I am going to throw that spoiler out there. That's what you have coming your way if you watch that film.
All right, cool.
You forgot the mermaid. There's a mermaid too.
I will always just say that, and this isn't going to be a Laura and John combat each other's stream, but I'm always going to remind myself when you try to dissuade me from something that she doesn't like La La Land at all, John. Just remember that. But we're not going to go there. No. Anyway, let's get back on track. So I was talking about, catching up on the filmography. It always cracks me up that my first exposure to Anya Taylor Joy, like the first thing that I actually saw with her in it was her voice performance in The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, which was so funny because then when I saw the next thing I saw was Emma. So I immediately was like, oh my God, it's the princess from Dark Crystal. Meanwhile, everybody else had, obviously was absolutely in love with Anya for all her previous work. And I've been catching up slowly. And I've seen, great stuff from her, especially in the Queen's Gambit, which, oh my God, just absolutely phenomenal. But the fact that this was her first film performance is just, it blows me away because it is such an assured, like, wonderful performance that, just, I mean, just to watch her go through the whole movie and then seeing, what she does at the end with the, with the laughter and and all that stuff. It's so amazing. The fact that this was first for her as well as for Robert Eggers is just mind blowing because it's such a brilliant piece of work. So again, I'm just overjoyed that I did see it, and not only did I like it, but I just completely loved it. It's just an amazing film.
What I would just say about Anya Taylor Joy on that front is, while this was her feature debut, it's remarkable how much influence it turns out that like just her casting actually had on the movie in the way that she inspired Robert Eggers and to shape the story. Because before, being so enamored with this movie, I've gone back and listened to a lot of the interviews Robert Eggers and Anya Taylor Joy have done about it and their process in making it. And one thing that was interesting was that, Robert Eggers essentially wrote the script on spec. He was working as a production designer at the time, and it took him 4 years to find somebody who would convince him to make this movie. And while the script was going through these drafts, originally it was more focused as like a family type of drama, in the sense that there wasn't a true lead. It was more of an ensemble. And when he showed it to some producer friends who he really liked and who he respected, they were like, we don't know if we can get this movie financed. And one of the problems is that it doesn't have a lead. But if you give us a central protagonist to follow, we might be able to scrape together the budget to get this movie made. And so we went back and revised it. And in doing so, that it really became clear to him that the character of Thomason needed to be the lead in that sense. But as he was adapting it, he was like kind of trying to find the right tone to pitch this, to pitch it in. And once he had settled on that and he was starting to interview actresses, when Anya Taylor Joy came up, you know, this was her first ever movie, but she just had this kind of ethereal quality to her, but also this intense spark to her that like made it clear to him that like this is not the kind of actress who could play a victim or a Puritan, like a meek Puritan girl. And that's why he cast her. That's why this movie works, because her kind of essential spark and vivaciousness in this very repressive kind of system and role is what allows this movie to come alive. Because as he said, it's like, you don't believe that this girl could be, you know, a member of a Puritan society. And she isn't in this movie. She's effectively but she's ostracized. And and throughout the movie, like she has a kind of modern quality that makes us want to root for her, even as she is speaking in Old English and as she is, you know, suffering greatly. But as the role goes on, like she doesn't, you know, accept the conventions of her time. And that makes her, like, our sympathies naturally lie with her. And Anya is kind of what helped bring that out of the role during the process. Even though I've read the script, the shooting script is incredibly faithful to the movie, but Anya's like imprint is on it. And the movie would not be what it is without her.
Yeah. And the story overall is such a great, the story, although if you look at it on the face of it, all the stuff that happens is very, very disturbing. but it is a story taking a look at someone, like a young girl coming of age and becoming, her true self, and sort of stepping away from the restrictions of, how she's brought up. It just unfolds in a very, chilling, horrific way. And maybe this isn't the way to do it in the modern world. But no, it's so good. And I do want to talk about like some of my early impressions watching this movie, because whatever I thought I was going to see, and I had a feeling it was going to be freaky and disturbing, but man, this movie starts off with, a baby being taken and, grinded up. and this, which I can't even say it, like covering yourself. Geez, oh God. I was just, like I said earlier, I was typing away in the chat. I was like, what the fuck is happening? And but it was in a way that made me really not overjoyed for what was happening on screen, but overjoyed for my reaction to it, because you don't often get that, when you're watching movies. And sometimes it can be cathartic just to be like, oh shit. But what makes it work, like this movie going really horrific, right from the opening, is just that this is such a beautifully made film, and the artistry is so incredible. And I also love that, it shows like what I was just describing, and then it goes to, this back, this shot in darkness of like the witch, starting to rise up off the ground, and then this shot from the back starting to like fly in the air, but it's done in a way like this movie, kind of linking up with other conversations we've had, Jared, of at its core, this movie is dealing with stuff that could be considered like very pulp in a way, like it's witchcraft and stuff, but it's because it has that added element of like extreme like horror and like the disturbing qualities of like how it's visualizing it and stuff. It's just the way it all comes together is so masterful that it almost dares you to laugh at something, but it's so horrific and so chilling that you can't. You're just like, you're entranced, and you can't look away even if you want to like hide behind your hands. It's just so, I don't have, I've used all the words I can think of to describe it, but I really hope you're happy, Laura, that I was thoroughly freaked out by this movie.
Yeah, that's what I live for. I wake up in the morning. How can I freak out John Webster today? Of course, that's my goal.
Yeah.
I do want to ask a question about the very start of the film, if that's okay, and kind of pick your brains about that. We don't need to move chronologically, but this is just always a thought that I've had. And I want to read out one of, Ralph's earliest quotes from this film as well, if that's okay, as a part of this question. So when the film starts, he and his family are being banished into the wilderness because obviously there has been a disruption between their family, the town in New England that they have been residing in. And it seems like it's obviously over a disruption of how they're interpreting the New Testament and how they're interpreting religion and the faith that they all seem to be putting forth. And William says, "What went out we into this wilderness to find, leaving our country, kindred, our father's houses, we have travailed a vast ocean for what? Was it not for the pure and faithful dispensation of the Gospels and the kingdom of God? I cannot be judged by false contented Christians under an unseparated church, under an English king's church." And that always stood out to me because it made me think, was he and his family, but mainly he is the patriarch of this household, unhappy because they had moved and crossed and sought out this puritanical community because they were trying to escape Christianity as it was being, laid out and practiced in England at the time. And they were trying to get away from that monarchy and that sort of grasp over their, religious claws being sunk into them in that way. Or was William and his family actually too pious for the community, and they were the ones that were a bit too extreme in their understanding of the gospel and their faith? Because it makes me think, as they go out into the wilderness and he and his family are now segregated to this sort of existence, not knowing whether they're going to make it or not, in complete isolation. Should we be sympathetic to this family because they have been banished unnecessarily because this town has been too judgmental? Or are they actually deserving of this banishment because their practicing of religion has actually gone too far the other direction in a really dangerous and unhealthy sort of way? And I think it's an important question to ask. And I wish we had learned more about why they were being banished, because I want to know, should I be feeling sympathetic toward this family, or are they deserving of this fate that they've been now given?
Yeah, I've always been like the few times that I've seen this movie, I have been curious about that. But on the other hand, I rather like that it's left ambiguous, because I like that the way we enter this story is that we're left to find these people and maybe judge them based on how they present themselves in the situation we find them in. And the fact that we don't know all the details of what led up to this. So we can't bring the past into sort of our, what's the word I'm looking for? Our appraisal of them, I guess. And it's, it's kind of like coming into the middle of a story, and you don't have necessarily all the information, but you have the information that's pertinent to the situation that they're going through. But still, I'm curious. And I definitely think it is left ambiguous. I think my inclination at first was that it felt to me like maybe William, and his family, and maybe William more so, and perhaps Catherine as well, were a bit more too strict, more strict than the rest of the village. But that's sort of me just filling in the gaps, because I think it is up to the viewer, because we aren't told explicitly.
Yeah, that was my interpretation as well, because it doesn't seem to me at the beginning of the movie that they are being cast out because they're insufficiently faithful. It seems to me that William has been kind of raising trouble in the town because he is of the belief that the town itself is not living up to its religious providence as a kingdom of God that they crossed the sea to find. Being Puritan, they're kind of entrenched into these like Calvinist doctrines, and that doctrine involves a very strict interpretation of the religious text. One of the things that Robert Eggers mentioned in the behind the scenes interviews is in this era, it was actually illegal, for instance, to not teach your children to read, because the only way to have that communion with God was to be able to read the word of God in the Bible. So if you couldn't do that, then you couldn't actually follow the tenets of the faith. Even if you couldn't write, you needed to be able to read. And while we don't know the specifics of what led it to this point, it really does seem to me like William, as by his own admission, is a very prideful man. That is his primary sin. And he admits it like later in the movie as the afflictions start to pile upon him and his family. And he almost chooses exile in a way, because he is just done with this church. He is done with these people who he thinks are not following the path and the word of God sufficiently. And he takes his family with him. And that kind of set me up for an interpretation of his character and Catherine's character that made me think, okay, they're going to be very rigid and hard and strict and tyrannical towards their children, and maybe that's what's going to cause the problem. But it actually surprised me that I actually do have sympathy for them, even if I do think that they're in this situation largely by their own fault, because we see that despite being very religious fundamentalists, William is not a tyrant towards his family. He actually is more of a father who wants to provide for his wife and his children, and we see that he does have affection for them and care for them. And if you try to put yourself in his mindset, you can think that if he truly believes that the way to have salvation and go to heaven is by strictly following the word of God, and these people in the town are not doing it in the way he thinks will, actually lives up to that promise, then, he is doing what he believes to be right. But of course, he is also a kind of a hypocrite in some ways, because he also does, he lies, he is sinful in many ways, and as is Catherine, and as are all the members of the family. But one of the tenets of their religion is that mankind is born in sin, in original sin, and that looms very large. And that is like, for instance, what the conversation that William has with his son Caleb when, after Samuel disappears and Caleb's distressed because he believes Samuel wasn't baptized. Does that mean he's going to hell after he dies? And William is trying to counsel his son there that, we don't know the truth, like what God's plan is, and we just have to try and follow the tenets of the word, because only God knows whether or not someone will have been saved, even if they weren't, baptized. But he, believing it is one thing, living it is another. And obviously that kind of tension between the alleged purity of William's beliefs and the actions of his family and the circumstances that they brought themselves into, that's the inherent tension that kind of leads to the rot in at the heart of the family that opens them to the evil in the wood, in the form of the witch and the devil's influence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so yeah, looking at it in terms of, whether, the family should have sympathies or not. That's kind of why I like that, even though I lean in that direction, it's also still uncertain. So, and like when it comes to drama, I always find that, even if I think someone's gone wrong, but if the drama elicits our sympathy by showing the characters, in situations which are sympathetic, that's sort of the difference between real life and drama, is I'm allowed to, I identify with and care for people who maybe in real life I would take a more, I would look at it a bit harsher, but I just love that even though William kind of, you definitely argue he brings a lot of this on himself, still there's moments where, he, like when he's asking for forgiveness and when he says it's all my fault, I feel sympathy for him, even in the face of, some of his beliefs and, which, it's the time. And especially if you look at, it through the lens of what we're being presented with in the story, and in this world, we're being presented with the reality of something that people believed in very fervently, back then in the world of this film. The superstition that people had about witches is actually true, because we're being presented with it. So I'm a little less critical of, it seems reasonable from his perspective and the perspective of the family that, that they kind of believe the things that they do. And so, yeah. Yeah, so I'm mixed. Like I don't think like he's without fault, certainly, but I also have sympathy for him. And it's that wonderful thing that that storytelling can do.
Oh. Where would you like to move next? I mean, I really would love to also start talking about the children. I mean, I feel like we haven't even gotten to the twins yet. We talked about Thomas and we've talked about Caleb, but Mercy and Jonas, Samuel. But this is, your thing. So I'm just gonna talk about what you want to talk about.
If I think that Caleb is like, pure child who should have been saved, then Mercy and Jonas, I'm kind of fine with them being thrown in the fire.
Breaking news: John Webster okay with murder of 5-year-old twins.
Yeah, Mercy and Jonas definitely fall into the realm of creepy children in horror movies. But what's interesting about them is that, they're effectively seduced by the devil, by Black Phillip, who is, as we discover, Lucifer in the form of a beast. And he is whispering to them. But because they're so young, they don't have a true understanding about what it is to have a conversation with the devil, especially
excuses.
Well, yes, but I would say on that front is that we are meant to be annoyed by them, as Thomason is annoyed by them, but also creeped out by them, because one of the early elements that really kind of sets your teeth on edge is when they're dancing around in the yard, with the Black Phillip rhyme, and when you actually listen to it, you're like, they're like, Black Phillip, crowns from his head, to Nanny Queen is wed, and then they're like, Black Phillip, king of all, and you're like, oh shit. But what's interesting about it is it really the dynamic really crystallizes for me in that scene where Mercy confronts Thomason at the brook, because you can tell in that scene that she's making all these comments about Black Phillip whispering to her and saying that Thomason may be a witch, but it's just play to her. It's just words. And the moment that Thomason kind of turns the tables and starts to play into the idea that, like, yes, Mercy, I be the witch of the wood. I took Samuel to my master. My soul slips from my body at night and signs the devil's book. All of Mercy's artifice drops away in that scene. She's terrified, and she believes Thomason is actually telling the truth. And it's because she's susceptible, because she's a child, and so is Jonas. And they are really meant to be they're innocent, even if they're not, even if they do bear some responsibility for their actions. It's not nice what they're doing, teasing Thomason, accusing her of being a witch, but they also don't know any better. And it's they don't necessarily deserve the fate that their ambiguous fate, because we do not learn what happens to them. They just literally vanish. And the implication I'm more meant to believe is that they were killed, but we never see their bodies. Something even worse could have happened to them. And no child deserves that. No, so it's just one of those things that, their dynamic is meant to really kind of underscore Thomason and Caleb's story, because Jonas and Mercy are not the most in-depth characters. Really, it's Thomason and Caleb who are lens through this world, because they are the ones who are old enough to understand, and they have their own dynamic that we can get into. But I don't blame Jonas and Mercy, but I do agree that we are meant to be weirded out by them.
So weirded out, but yeah, it is chilling, the fact that we can guess what happens to them, but the fact that we don't see is so much, is so disturbing, because of other things that we've seen earlier in the movie. The fact that that's left unseen is like, oh shit. But no, and it's just so that scene where, by the water, where then she gets freaked out by Thomason and really scared. That's just it's so wonderfully done, because you're we can very much sympathize with that of, the older sister is sick and tired of, the younger sister, being, to her mind like a pest. And she's like, all right, I'm going to scare her right now. But the fact that like, that with this type of movie and this type of story, like that's a bad thing to be doing, and that's going to come back to bite her later. And sure enough, it does. Yeah, so chilling. And most of my ire for the twins is later on with their shenanigans, during the the stuff with Caleb.
Yeah,
but they don't deserve what they get.
No, but I do feel sympathetic towards Thomasin at the brook as well, because she is experiencing a lot of guilt at the hands of her parents for saying Samuel's death is on you because you were watching him, you were responsible for him, when she probably shouldn't have been, because again, this is not your child to raise, it's just a sibling. But hello, patriarchy, you're mom's oldest daughter, so she's just following in her footsteps of being what a maternal figure should be. But Catherine and William definitely place blame on Thomasin for Samuel's death, and so she's contending with that on the top of Caleb, Mercy, and Jonas, particularly Mercy and Jonas, chiding her on Samuel died because of you. It wasn't whether it was a wolf, whether it was a witch, he died at your hands. And so I can see how in that moment she's fed up with it, and she's just like, you know what? Maybe I will scare the crap out of you right now because it's going to get you to back off. And misplaced and ill-fated decision. But I think it was also a lot of foreshadowing for what she was going to turn out to be. I think that was a very clear moment of just, this is the path that she is on. She is actually going to become a witch herself by the end of this. And so I think that was just a nice little insert there as well, just giving us a glimpse into what her future was going to be by the end of this film.
Oh, yeah. It just, foreshadowing that I had no idea was actually going to be foreshadowing, because there's no way to contemplate where this film is actually going to go. But yeah, in the face of what the very creepy, chilling end of this movie, you go back to watch that scene, you're like, ooh, that's actually right on the money.
Yeah.
But no, yeah, I absolutely understand, because like I said, and it's interesting because Jared, like you said, she's a very modern, character, and so the fact that from a modern sensibility, we can very much understand like her having it, at that point, and she's, with all the, blame that she's getting from, the family, and she's just sick and tired of, of that guilt. And so the last thing she wants is, Mercy coming up on here and, doing her thing. And it's, so she's just sick of it. And so it's very understandable, just like any older sibling who takes the opportunity to mess with their, with their younger, brother or sister. And it's like, I'm going to have a bit of fun here, but in this situation, it's a very precarious thing to do, which she doesn't quite realize at the time. And then later on, it has very dire consequences. But yeah, no, it's, like I said, that's a wonderful scene just because it's so fraught with tension.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and even before the Mercy shows up, the scene has another layer to it at the beginning, where because there's the dynamic between Thomasin and Caleb, which their relationship is an interesting one, because they're actually very, like, they're clearly the two who are the closest, and there's the most affection there. And Caleb does not blame Thomasin for Samuel's death in the same way that Catherine does, or when William might silently, and the twins do. He just wants to understand because his brother is gone, and he's worried that his brother might be in hell, which is a very real thing because Caleb's faith is very pure at this stage.
And I do want to say, like, that the scene between Caleb and William early on, when like he's asking these questions of, is my brother in hell, like that just it shows how screwed up all those puritanical thinking is. And like the fact that because Samuel wasn't baptized, that like that means that because he died that he might go to hell. Like that's just a horrific thing, and especially to put into the mind of a young kid. And so I said earlier that I have sympathy for for William in spite of, but like I just feel sorry for all the children who are having all this stuff pushed on them, when it's it's just absolutely horrible.
Yeah, and Caleb is probably the most sympathetic character in this movie. Thomasin as well, although Thomasin also has a little bit more of an edge to her that gives us the sense that like she, we're meant to question Thomasin a little bit more than Caleb, who is very much coded to us as someone who wants to do right because he is, he wants to not only like protect his family, he wants to, he wants his family to stay together, and he wants them all to go to heaven together. But he also is a preteen boy who is being placed with a lot of responsibility, and the whole, dynamic of sexuality in this age group is a whole undercurrent there, because clearly this family is very isolated out in the wilderness. They are not around any other families their age. Thomasin is, approaching her womanhood, and Caleb is now hitting puberty, and the only girl around his age who is there is his sister.
So of course it's her fault. It's not her parents' fault for isolating.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's the thing about the reason I bring that up is that it's actually not the movie doesn't take sides on that front that, oh, what's going on here is wrong, because Caleb is clearly uncomfortable and ashamed by the fact that he's sneaking inadvertent glances at his sister, and Thomasin kind of is not entirely discouraging it, but it's not meant to be anything more than that. Like when I mentioned that I read the screenplay, and that scene where at the brook where Caleb comes up and he sees Thomasin, washing the clothes there, and he kind of sneaks a glance at her, and then she kind of like gives him a little smile. It's like, what are you doing? But then she tells him to come over and by her, and she like hugs him. And it's a very comforting hug. It's not like a lustful scene, and he's clearly comfortable with her. And the script itself gives a full description of it, and the quote that they use to describe it is, quote, innocently incestuous, end quote. So these are not Jaime and Cersei Lannister. These are two kids who are confused and who are trying to figure out their sexuality in a very repressed society where there are no other children their age around. And so of course you feel sympathy for them because they don't mean anything by this. Like they love each other as brother and sister, and they're just trying to figure out their dynamic. And like that moment when they're talking about sending Thomasin away to another family, and then that's when Caleb takes it upon himself, I'm going to go hunt in the woods so I can provide for us so that Thomasin doesn't have to go away. That's not portrayed as like a selfish act. It's portrayed as, I don't want you to have to leave. I don't want you to have to do this. And Thomasin, like, clearly is like touched by that. And she, like, she wants to go with him. It's not a like, oh, let's go get into trouble together. It's like, this is the one member of her family that she actually kind of trusts. And of course, it all goes horribly wrong. And that's part of the tragedy, in that having already lost Samuel, now Caleb is disappearing on her watch. And that whole conflicted sexuality dynamic with Caleb is the primer for his encounter with the witch. Because, yeah, there are so many things going on in that scene.
And enter John being so, like, disturbed on so many different levels in that sequence. Yeah, what to say about that?
Well, what I would say about that is that the actress who portrays the witch in her young form, her name is Sarah Stevens. She's actually more of a model than an actress. In that, I say that in the sense that I haven't seen a lot of other acting credits for her, but she was perfectly suited for this role because she has very much an ethereal quality to her, and that entire sequence is one of the highlights of the movie because from as he approaches the hut and as she emerges, and you see like the camera fixates on her face and the way her eyes kind of look a little bit, ethereal, and she has that strange smile on her face. It's a performance that wordlessly gives the sense that this woman is not of this earth. And for someone like Caleb, who has never seen anyone like her before, even though he's terrified, he's entranced. He can't move. And that's one of the reasons why the scene is so incredibly effective, because we know this is bad. This is one of the most terrifying scenes in the entire movie. And Caleb is helpless against this woman who is imbued with the powers of the devil. And as she approaches him and as she draws in very sensually and as she moves in to kiss him, you're like Caleb isn't like enjoying this. He doesn't know how to process it. And when their lips meet, that's when we get one of the movie's few jump scares, and probably its most effective one, because when she seizes him from by the head, and you can see it's the kind of the crone's hand instead of the young woman's hand, and then the screen cuts to black, it's bone chilling, because you know that like this young boy Caleb was trying to be a man, to help his family, to protect his sister, but he was not ready for this. He was not ready to go off into the wood alone. He was not ready, and he met the literal devil and his servant in the form of the witch, and it leads to him effectively meeting his own demise.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about the music in both this scene and various other points in the movie. There's a lot of use of like really freaky choral music. It's what it reminded me of is the use of, I'd have to look up the composer's name, but it's a requiem that's used in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It very much reminds me of that, of like when they're going, the scenes that involve either apes or humans, walking up to the monolith in that film, and that freaky, choral singing. And it is the same kind of vibe here. And it just makes for, several scenes in this movie, but especially this one, just one of the most sort of terrifying, disturbing, moments. I mean, granted, also I'm not a horror aficionado, so so this, feeling that way is a bit rarer for me. But it's so amazingly well done, but so just Yeah, I keep using the word disturbing, but I can't figure out another word for it. It's superbly executed.
Yeah, I just want to echo off of what you said, Jared, because it's always very telling to me too, is that Caleb never places blame on Thomason or his parents or anyone else for his trauma or for the misgivings that he faces. If anything, he blames himself for not being pious enough, for not being holy enough. We think back to the conversation that he has with his father in the woods, saying, is Samuel in hell? And I ask this question because if I were to die today, would I go to hell? I have a sinful nature. And he doesn't say it to his father, but he knows he's been making passes, looks at his sister that are just, unbecoming, that he knows are probably wrong. He knows that's sinful. And so he's holding himself to account for that. And so he questions, if I were to die today, would I go to hell? And the fact that his father basically just says, well, I don't know, maybe. I can't answer that for you. This kid is going to he's going to be going to bed just having nightmares, continually thinking like, I'm doomed. I'm fated to, this existence in, eternal agony, because if Samuel, a babe who is unbaptized, who is, sinless in nature, can't even make it into heaven, what hope have I, when I'm just so much more bent out of shape at this point, and my dad's just over here being like, yeah, you're probably, maybe, like, I don't know. This kid is just going to have so much trauma moving forward. And then so to fast forward to his interaction with, the witch in the woods, who is just made out to be, a sensual and very ethereal being, using your terminology, where he's taken in by that. He comes back to the farm and I'm sure we'll get to talking about too his death scene and his monologue in that, which is just even more utterly terrifying, but just so well acted on his part. I mean, kudos to Harvey all day for that. But even in his last moments leading up to his death, he probably thought, am I still destined for hell? I don't know. Well, I mean, I'll have more thoughts on that when we talk about his monologue, but this kid was just living a life of terror at the hands of what his parents were instilling in him in terms of the unknown nature of the faith that they profess, but then just can't even answer for or have accountability for.
I'm just, now I'm just imagining like a modern language translation for the film and just seeing, William go, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, though, if you wanted to turn this, like, this movie has very few like pure out and out comedic beats. There are elements of it that are funny if you look at them in a certain light, but part of the, it's a very bleak movie, and it's a very part of that's just the language and the atmosphere. But yeah, if you wanted to turn this movie into a comedy, then just translate it into regular English, because then it's like then you have basically dynamics. Like the robot chicken version of this movie would be Caleb asking his father, "Is Samuel in hell?" And his father going, "Fuck if I know," which is not, but that's actually part of the thematic power of the movie, is that these characters are defined in many ways by their faith, by their religion, and they are constantly praying, they're constantly striving to live up to what they believe to be God's word. But part of the absolute horror of this movie is that faith that they have they don't see much in the way of return on it, with the possible exception of Caleb in his death scene, which we'll get to. He actually does seem like he might be the one character who kind of gets a happy ending, as weird as it is to say in this movie, in that he might actually he might my interpretation of that scene, if we are taking heaven and hell to be real, is in this movie is that he actually does get into heaven in that scene. But I would say that all the characters, when they need it most, are trying to reach out to God for answers. And in this movie, God is silent. And the woods around them are silent. And in that silence, the devil whispers, the witches cry. And that is the siren song that lures all of these characters to their doom.
Yeah, we're gonna have to stretch happy ending.
In relative terms.
Oh well, we'll talk about it. I just want to pause for a quick second, just in the mid-roll. We'll do this quickly so we can dive back into the conversation. And next week, we're actually going to be having a change of day. That was we hadn't planned on doing this again because we did it a number of weeks ago, but next Sunday is this little thing called the Oscars, and they're actually starting an hour earlier than usual. And we're going to be discussing the film Dune Part 2, and that's not going to be a quick stream. So we thought it was wise that we move this to Saturday instead of Sunday. So next week on Saturday, same time, 6 p.m. Eastern, we'll be talking about Dune Part 2, which I am going to get to go see tomorrow. And then we do have we've gone ahead and made a plan for many weeks that follow. But we won't read all that out just yet. But I will say some of the stuff we have coming ahead. On March 17th, we're going to be talking about the 1995 Ang Lee film Sense and Sensibility. And then on March 24th, we'll be talking about Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which is one of my all-time favorites. I was so happy to hear you love it as well, Jared, because we're going to have a lot of fun talking about that one. And then we have the next couple months planned out, so we'll let you know what we have coming up as we get closer to those. Yeah, I mean, that's really all I've got to say. You guys want to mention anything for the mid-roll before we pop back in?
No, just that having the stream on Saturday is our kind of opportunity to try to give Dune Part 2 the time and the care that it deserves, especially because both of us will be seeing the movie for the first time just this week, and we won't have the opportunity to rewatch it and kind of dissect it on that granular level. It'll be much more of a first impression, but based on everything that we're hearing about it, it seems like it's the kind of movie that is going to be worth exploring in detail. And we don't want to do that in a way that when we're also trying to pay attention with split focus to the Oscars, because I like to watch the Oscars every year. I know, John, you have a more conflicted relationship with it at times, but this year we're both invested because our collective favorite movie of 2023, Oppenheimer, looks like it's going to pull off a pretty comprehensive sweep of a lot of the top categories, and we want to be there to cheer it on.
Yeah, and we'll probably do a couple, mentions about some of the movies we love on Saturday's stream, building up to Sunday. Speaking of which, also something else I want to announce, already announced it in the Slack group, but if you are in the Here Be Dragons Slack group, and I know we have a couple newer viewers to this channel who aren't in the group, so if you're either watching this silently or you come back to it later and you want to join in on this, I probably should have my email or something. Let me go ahead and type up. Anyway, I'm going to say what I'm hinting around what this is actually all about. I'll mention in a second. If you're not in the Here Be Dragon Slack group and you want to call, go ahead and send me an email, and I'll get you in, because on next Sunday we will be doing a Oscars watch party. Which right now it's just, whoever wants to pop in. But if we get some, new people who want to join the channel and join in with us, that would be a lot of fun, because I've never done that before. And I have a feeling it'll make the ceremony more enjoyable when it's about hanging out with friends and not getting pissed off because my preferred choice doesn't win. Although that won't be as much of a problem this year, I think. But anyway, so yeah, we'd love to have you. And yeah, that would be a lot of fun. So that's it. Anything you want to advertise, Laura?
Yeah, I'll just start off by saying, speaking of the Oscars, y'all remember that year when Moonlight won?
Mhm.
Really, really solid year that year. Like, just top tier film, taking it away from
that was
an
a
unworthy
farce.
one. So, yeah, there's that. I will say, selfish, shameless plug. If you have in any way found this video about a horror film, but you are also a Gilmore Girls fan, which is a very mixed bag, but I am living proof that it can exist. I do have a Gilmore Girls podcast, which I do with a very wonderful friend of mine. You can find a link to our channel in the description below. So if you need a palate cleanser from this particular episode, go check out our channel. We keep it very thematic, very topical, so it's not just gushing about the show and those episode recaps. I think you'll find some really enlightening content over there. So please feel free to give us a listen. We appreciate it.
Yeah, and if you want the link to their channel, it's in the description. So definitely check it out, because you guys are doing such amazing work over there. I've been really proud when, I'm not always able to pop in, but whenever I do, it's very rewarding, even though I've been remiss in not watching the series, but even so, I've found your discussions to be really entertaining and insightful, even if I don't, catch all the direct references to the show. You guys are still knocking it out of the park.
Thank you. I appreciate it, as I'm sure Kate does, who is my podcast co-host, also in the chat this evening. So shout out to her as well, because she is a wonderful partner to have doing that podcast with. So, but we appreciate your support and that compliment. So,
okay, let's dive back in so we can try, because I did say we're going to try to keep this stream, to 2 hours. So let's see if we're able to do that. So, okay, where did we leave off? We were talking about Caleb, and we're going to go into, you would just want to go into his, the death scene, and, all that entails. Like, okay, so I didn't know what was going to happen. The scene, I saw like bits of it in the trailer. And like I said, my reference for horror movies is Alien. So forgive me, but I thought something was going to come bursting out of his chest at some point. Something did come out of his mouth. So
we'll talk about that too, because I have thoughts about that. But yeah, I'll let you guys go first.
But I was like, I was tense about this scene in the way that I was, referring back to Alien again. I remember, like, with Alien, I knew about the chestburster scene. I just hadn't seen the movie. So I just remember I paused that movie about 20 times when it got near that scene, because I kept like getting up and pacing around and like being terrified about what was coming up. So it was with the same apprehension that I was sitting here, watching this. I was like, oh God, I don't like these kind of scenes, but it's like, oh God, and it's so freaky with then the stuff going on with the twins, which I have to get your guys' read on that, because I'm actually not entirely sure what's going on with them at that point, if it's all play acting or if there's something else going on. Or you guys will have to tell me what you think about all that. But yeah, I don't even know what to say other than it's the sequence is scary, because of course, the last we see of Caleb is, the witch's hand grabbing him, and then the next we see, he comes, stumbling back onto the farm, and we don't know like what's going on with him, and at one point we just hear him scream, and in the house, and then and then there's lots of quoting of scripture. There's an apple coming out of his mouth. There's a whole lot of freaky stuff that just, again, my reaction to all this was just, what the fuck?
Well, what I would say about this scene is, it is one of, if not the most important scenes in the entire movie. And part of the reason for that is that this is the moment where the family dynamic that has already been strained and stretched and put under all kinds of pressure truly irrevocably shatters. And that's why it was such a critical scene for the writer and the director, Robert Eggers, and for his cast. And he's talked about this in behind the scenes interviews, that because he had like 4 or 5 years where he was like planning out this movie, he had a very specific idea about what he wanted in almost every scene. But specifically with this scene, with Caleb's death, in his script, he talks about how it really is just, in his words, 11 pages of screaming on the page. And what he means by that is, this was the scene where he realized, to get this right, I can't like block this out in my mind. I have to get in the room with my actors, with my cinematographer, Yaron Blaschke, and figure this out together. And they do. And one of the feats that makes it so impressive is it all hinges in many ways on all of these actors and their interpersonal dynamics, but especially on the actor playing Caleb, young, his name's Harvey Scrimshaw. And one of the things that Robert Eggers talks about is, in this scene, Harvey is having to handle incredibly complicated material. And because he's so young, because he's a child, they can't actually, as the directing team, explain to him the full intended thematic subtext of what this scene entails, because it would violate certain laws related to child actors. So they had to give him the gist of what to play, and then trust him to find the right intention without actually telling him what was really happening. And if you watch this scene, you would never know that, because this kid gives one of the most terrifying and best performances of a possessed child that you will ever see. But it's also like, it's a dynamic where it's not The Exorcist, he's not in he's not possessed in the way that it's the literal devil inside of him, like spewing venom at his family. That might actually be easier for a child actor to play. He's in conflict. He is fighting what the possession that has taken hold of him. And and that scene where, he coughs up the bloody apple, that's a actual practical effect. Another thing that Robert Eggers mentions in his behind the scenes commentary, there are no computer generated effects in this movie. None. There's some computer compositing, but everything you see is a created image rendered in the frame. So that kid was actually trying to, they're doing some visual trickery, but the actual bloody apple that comes out of his mouth, That really happened. And the dynamic that's at play is that when I mentioned that Caleb gets a happy ending, that may not have been the right terminology, but what I mean was that Caleb throughout this entire movie has been absolutely tormented by the unknown, by questions of unanswered faith, and now he's being tormented, having been poisoned effectively with a literal poisoned apple from a poisoned kiss by a witch, but he's not surrendering to it. He's not going quietly, and even as he's suffering, there comes a moment where he actually seems to, for lack of a better word, see the light. And that entire final speech that he's given, even if it's absolutely horrifying to his parents who are watching their child die, and Thomason who's watching her brother die and is getting blamed for it from all directions by her younger siblings, by her mother. In that scene, Caleb actually seems to, he talks about seeing the light, seeing Jesus. He's like, take me into your lap. Oh Lord, you are my salvation. And when he dies with a smile on his face. And it's one of the weird dynamics where it's like, did this kid actually somehow manage to find his way through this unequivocal horror that he was afflicted with? And did his faith save him? Or was it just the tormented ramblings of a dying mind? We'll never know. But Caleb believes it in that moment. And when he dies, he doesn't die in the same level of fear and misery that all of the other characters experience at their end. And so, and again, this kid is playing this without knowing the full subtext of those scenes, which makes it all the more impressive.
I have to admit, just because of how horrific this movie is, I was taking a more cynical view on it, and that whatever was going on with him in those moments, it's like you said earlier, that God is silent throughout this movie, and so that for me that carried over to this, and that that he's just, maybe he thinks he's seen something, but from my point of view, that's too hopeful of a scenario for this story. But it would be nice to think so.
That's a valid interpretation. Yeah. I just kind of feel like that when I said that what God is silent throughout this movie and the devil clearly has agency in this world, that scene is the one scene where if you wanted to make an interpretation that is God opening his arms to accept one of his children into heaven, that's really the only place where you can see that, because and everywhere else the characters' prayers go completely unanswered, and the devil and his agents just destroy them. But in this scene, Caleb does seem to find something, even if it's a delusion in his dying moments. And given the fact that he is coded as the most pure and hopeful character in the movie, that's why I think both interpretations are valid, whether you want to, but I also think you can do a very bleak reading of, the honest fact. He dies, and that leaves his parents and his family devastated, and the family shatters, because once he's gone, everything that was holding them together is just irrevocably broken.
Yeah, I think if any other part of the movie had any glimmer of hope, maybe I could be hopeful in that scene. But I just, and that's not me wanting a bleak reading on it, but that's just what I felt watching it. So I don't know. It'd be nice to think otherwise, but yeah, it's just so chilling.
I actually am of the mindset that Caleb was probably the only member of that family who actually obtained a pass or an entry, so to say, into heaven. And if it's okay with you, I do want to read you just another quote that I have, which is actually historically based. This is, it's a part of the monologue that Caleb put forth, as he's dying. But Robert Eggers, my man, he did his homework in terms of historical and religious context with, just developing this script, because Caleb's dying monologue actually comes from a diary entry from John Winthrop, who was one of the puritanical founders of, this religious society in New England, and had such instrumental value with putting forth, again, just a Puritan nature within New England. And so this is actually the diary entry from John Winthrop, which echoes Caleb's dying words. And it says, "O my Lord, my love, how wholly delectable thou art. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for his love is sweeter than wine. How lovely is thy countenance. How pleasant are thy embraces. My heart leaps for joy when I hear the voice of thee, my Lord, my love. When thou sayest to my soul, thou art her salvation. O my God, my King, what am I but dust? A worm, a rebel, a thine enemy was I, wallowing in the blood and filth of my sins, when thou didst cast the light of countenance upon me, when thou spread over me the lap of thy love, and sayest that I should live." And so I think Caleb echoing that in his dying moments is Robert Eggers' proof to us that this kid made it. That even though the rest of his family probably faced eternal damnation, I think, especially with Caleb's physical movements in that moment, reaching forward, being lifted up as if he was trying to grasp sort of like, a white light in front of him. I think this was the director trying to let his audience know that this kid in this moment in time was entering into God's presence in heaven, even though the rest of the family was just going to be completely effed in that regard. I think that was this end result here. And again, just endless shout out to Robert Eggers for just doing such due diligence when creating this script, because drawing on all of this historical context is just, even just aside from a religious perspective, but just from a historical perspective, is astounding to me.
Yeah, and that's one of the elements that makes this movie so incredibly effective, because I'm so glad that you read that passage out in full and gave it proper context, because Robert Eggers did do that. He went back and pulled dialogue, word for word in some cases, from journals of the time to give it the more authentic feel of what characters who would be experiencing things like witchcraft in this era would be feeling with. And the reason he does that is because he's talked extensively in his process about, in an era for a movie like this, where you're dealing with archetypal fears that are as possibly as old as time and humanity itself, if you want people to believe it, if you want them to believe that there is a witch in the wood and that all these characters are in danger, then you have to make people feel the authenticity. And that's why he was so demanding with things like, it's got to be the right, environment. It's got to be the right set. It's got to be the right costumes. His screenplay is incredibly specific in terms of place, objects, characters, even described like smells and sounds. And it's all in the name of authenticity to get you to effectively blend the idea that this is a real and living history. He describes it as wanting it to feel like it's something from his own memory, because as he says, his earliest memories or his earliest dreams were nightmares about witches growing up in, New England in when he was a child. And he wanted to recapture that feeling for this movie, and given the fact that we don't know this world, he has to create it for us. And to that effect, I since you read something, Laura, I just want to read a passage from that Robert Eggers includes at the beginning of his script, a little to the reader before the movie actually starts. And it really kind of informs his entire ethos throughout the way that he presents this world. And it's, it's like a paragraph, so I'll just read it all. Quote, in order to effectively depict this world in which ordinary people understood supernatural occurrences to be an expected part of life, it is essential that all aspects of the film to be carried out with utter naturalism. The characters must appear as real farmers, not actors with dirty faces. Even the supernatural elements must be photographed as realistically as possible. Yet, with all this authenticity and realism, it is still a folk tale, a dream, a nightmare from the past. And I just found that such an evocative and cool image, because the other thing that he talks about in his behind the scenes interviews is the idea that in this time period, except for the elites of the elites, what he refers to as the intelligentsia, who kind of lived above, were rich, were affluent, were kind of shielded from the horrors of the world. In this era, for most of the people living in it, fairy tales and folk tales and the real world were effectively the same thing, because these characters were living in an era and a time where there was danger in the woods. If you wandered off the path, you could get lost forever. If you didn't manage to find a way to provide for your family would starve. And if there were things in this world that their minds could not rationally explain. And there are elements in this movie that, if you wanted to, you could interpret it as, is this actually happening? Is this actually supernatural? Or is it these characters going insane or something? Like, there was a popular theory that maybe some of these psychedelic visions that that people in the 1630s experienced were actually caused by eating like moldy bread that had some psychotropic hallucinogens in it. That's a possible explanation, but these characters don't know. So for them, it's all real. And for us to feel that reality, you have to tell it in their words. And that's why the passage that you read, Laura, is so important, because those could be the words, for instance, of a character who is dying and believing he's about to pass into heaven. That is his authentic, real lived-in experience. And it's one of the reasons it's so damn effective, especially compared to other types of horror movies that reckon with similar subject matter.
Yeah, no, I do. What you just said about, there's a way to read this movie to question, like what is actually being shown, if it's, real or not. One of the moments I really like is when, when Thomason is locked up in the barn with Mercy and Jonas, and she's like, does Black Phillip really talk to you? And we're just shown this shot of this, black goat just kind of, sitting there looking like a black goat does. And it's like, is he just a goat or is he the devil? And it's like, if you look at anything long enough, you can think that, there is something inside of there.
I don't want to tangentialize either, but like, where did they get this goat? Because when they venture out into the wilderness, they're coming with a cart, which you have to imagine has food in it, basic provisions, but they didn't enter into this wilderness with any animals or any livestock. So they either had, like, I'm assuming they made a trip back to the village to purchase animals and then bring it back out with them. So did you, like, again, it's just, we could go down a rabbit hole here, but did you buy a goat from town that was normal, and then Lucifer enters into the goat once it gets back because it's like, hey, what's up? This family's due for a reckoning. Or was like Lucifer already present in the goat when it was like in the village? I mean, at some point in time, like this goat got possessed, but it's like, you bought the wrong goat that day? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that that's an element of the movie that is it's probably best that they don't show us. But yeah, that, as Guilty Undertaker points out, like the goat is meant to look unnatural to us because the movie is playing with archetypes and the idea that, you know, the devil would often appear in the form of a goat, as Thomason says, like isn't kind of an old archetype of this type of puritanical folklore from this era. Same with the hair. That was another that you see the freaky bunny in a couple of scenes. That's Robert Eggers talks in detail about the fact that the reason he chose that hair specifically was because hairs have a very specific evocative place in European folklore, but it didn't really translate to America because we don't have European hairs here. We have like jackrabbits, which are bunnies, which are kind of, you know, not as the same. But he wanted a hair specifically because we as American audiences are not used to seeing that. So when we see it there, we're like, that thing shouldn't be there. What is that? And it's a very primal instinct that's like triggered in our minds. And the goat is a similar idea because, yeah, whether the devil like literally assumed the form of that goat and then was purchased, or he like replaced the family goat, you know, we don't know. But yeah, and that's the other thing that Robert Eggers talks about is that apparently this goat was all of the scenes involving the goat were a nightmare to shoot because goats don't like to cooperate with filming crews. They make cats like the infamous Sir Pounce in Game of Thrones look tame. Just he would not follow directions, and they're dangerous. You know, you gotta wrangle them carefully. But yeah, it's I would say that it's better left up to interpretation on that front. But I do think that we're meant to be questioning like, what's the deal with this goat? Why does he seem off? And why do the children have such fascination with him? And when did he manifest himself in this way? And was he always this way, or did he become this way, or is he just the vessel for Lucifer himself? Because we do get the scene at the end of the movie where it's clear that, you know, Lucifer likes to go around with some fancy drip. He doesn't need to be rocking the form of a goat. If he was doing it, he was doing it for a reason, and clearly he fulfills that reason at the end. But it's a fun thing.
I just wanted to take a second to say hi to Jonas through the moon door. Great to see you, man. It's been a while. Thank you for tuning in. Yeah, no, it's. I mean, yeah, there's the hows and whys of Black Phillip.
No, I mean, we don't need to go any further on it. I think that this family probably went, like, I can imagine William going back into town, purchasing livestock. Lucifer in another form at that point in time noticed that like this family had been banished and ostracized into the wilderness and was just like, opportunity. Entered into the goat, came back, and then just was like, I'm gonna F this family up.
Which leads to one of the few truly hilarious lines in the movie is when William asks his unconscious child, quote, "Did you make some unholy bond with that goat?"
You know what? But now, like this question of what was the devil up to when he decided to torment this family in the form of Black Phillip? Now I'm imagining a crossover between the witch and the TV show Lucifer. And that just writes its own fan fiction right there. That would be a lot of fun. But well, before we, you mentioned Black Phillip in human form. Before we get to the and let's go back and let's talk about Kate Dickie and not being able to escape from certain tropes, shall we say?
I would argue that she seeks those types of roles out. She seems very enthusiastic about playing these types of characters.
Not saying like, but her and breastfeeding is a thing. Some twisted stuff. Once again, like a moment, like I don't know what I was expecting. It wasn't that. But of course, she gets up in the middle of the night, sees Caleb, holding Samuel. She's very happy to see them. Caleb is thoroughly creepy in that moment. But like all mothers, she doesn't seem to notice. And then she takes Samuel and, baby's hungry. And this is all happening at the same time when the witch is descending into the barn. And right when we get, and the witch's cackle, it cuts to Catherine laughing hysterically, having her breast pecked out by what is that, a raven or a crow?
It's a crow.
Okay, yeah.
But I have seen a lot of commentary on that scene and just going back to the movie in general, where people, once we get to the final act of this film, it becomes very apparent to us that what we have seen up until this point and at the end of this movie is actually truthful. This is what has played out. It is a reality. But at that moment in time, when Kate Dickie's character is having a dream sequence, envisioning her two now dead children being present, in her room, and everything up until this point, it begs the question of, was what was presented to us in acts 1 and 2 also dream sequences? Was what we were seeing actual reality, or was it just, fiction as a result of, again, someone's dream, as a result of someone hallucinating? And are our narrators up until this point reliable in terms of what they're presenting to us? And so I've seen commentary where people have watched the first 2/3 of this movie saying, maybe what we're seeing is not actually real. Maybe none of this is happening. Maybe this family has never even left the village and faced any of these things. And this is just all a falsehood and sort of a red herring. And then you get to the end of it and it's like, no, we all know by the end of it that this is actually, no, it actually all played out as we saw. But I think there's something to be said there for how Eggers inserted these dream sequences and sort of these really subtle nuggets, as if to say, like, I'm going to make you question whether this is actually truthful or not until the end of the film when we get that confirmation.
Yeah. No, I like that the movie flirts with that, but I also don't like when people are like, they're all imagining, it's all a dream. It ends up robbing, it's a story like this is, obviously the point is to, have a story where these things are real. And yeah, it's sorry, but I just when we got to this part, I'm like, I do wonder if this is what was written as is, or if you cast Kate Dickie and you're like, oh, let me screw this up a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, listening to her playing, like what she talks about in the behind the scenes interviews, I mean, she's clearly very enthusiastic about this type of material because she sees the humanity in her character. You know, her character is a mother, a devout woman who is, you know, trying to support her husband and take care of her family in this very dark and complicated situation. And her faith is going completely unrewarded in that way because she had one of the scenes that she has that's a pivotal scene for her character is when she talks to William after at Caleb's bedside about the idea that once Samuel was taken from her, her heart like turned to stone, and she is going through these motions, but she doesn't actually believe them anymore. And it's so she's going through the act of faith, but she has lost faith. And she also is like, she's breaking under the strain because when he says that, like, earlier she would have been like, we never should have left the village. And then finally William is starting to crack on and, you know, admit to his pride and be like, okay, I think you're right. It's time that we leave and go back to the village. And he's like, we'll be home soon enough. And she's like, I do want to be home in England, which means that she never wanted to leave and come to this wilderness in the first place. And as William says in the very first line of the movie, what went we into this wilderness to find, if not the kingdom of God? That tells us that in many ways, perhaps, like, I almost called her Lysa. Kate's original idea was that she never wanted to come and seek the kingdom of God here in the first place. So perhaps is that one of the things that kind of opened the family to corruption? She's a fascinating character because you feel tremendous sympathy for her as a mother who's losing her children in these horrific ways. But then also we are meant to be very frustrated with her that she's directing all of her blame and venom at her daughter for this. And, you know, and that's kind of, is that her kind of externalizing her own guilt and torment? Or is it just her slowly like going insane? Because I agree, Laura, like, I think that everything that happens in this movie is reality, perhaps a heightened reality in the same way that you kind of experience a heightened reality when you're afraid. But whether or not, for like the witch, for instance, she took Samuel and she killed him. And then she used his body to make an ointment. Whether or not she actually was flying or it's a hallucinogenic compound, that's a little bit more ambiguous. But these horrors are actually happening to this family. Caleb did die, even if, you know, what exactly it was that killed him, the devil's work or, you know, just prolonged exposure out in the freezing wood in the winter, perhaps that's up for interpretation. But these horrors are being inflicted on this family, and Kate and William are breaking under them in their inability to stop them. And William is taking it out on, you know, the fact that he can't protect his family. We see him constantly chopping wood, which eventually, you know, Thomason calls him out for. But and Kate is just kind of breaking mentally and blaming Thomason. And that scene where she sees Samuel and Caleb is the one scene where you're like, okay, this is some kind of like vision or dream sequence. But the raven pecking at her breast, that seems to be real, because when she wakes up the next morning, her breast is still bloody. And so the rot has like thoroughly set in by this point. And of course, you know, we know that they're all doomed at this point.
And then William gets up for a perfectly nice morning.
Or so he thinks.
I just, like, it's not funny while you're watching, but in retrospect, just the fact that he gets up, the look that he has on his face as he processes what he's seeing over at the barn is just like utter, like, confusion, bewilderment, and then sharp, jump scare, one of those, again, where, we're not even completely sure what just happened, but then of course, it's revealed that it's, Black Phillip, and we're like, oh, of course. And then that wonderfully iconic shot.
Oh boy.
Which you see this in the trailer, and you're like, that looks like one of those things that just looks wonderfully scary, but probably cut out of context. Oh, but the context is so right on.
Yeah.
I just, then everything goes haywire. It's at this point that the twins are missing. We have no idea what's happened to them. We see Thomason laying there all bloody with, the barn animals and, slaughtered, and, it's, and then Kate Dickie goes full, Lysa Arryn, although not without, reason, like, like her whole family's dead except for the person that, she thinks is responsible. And then again, stuff that I just don't expect to happen. It's like the fact that, Thomason will say, I love you. And then proceeds to kill Catherine. Just horrific and just shocking, and
and that it's heartbreaking on so many fronts for Thomason, because this, just to back up a little bit to the scene where after Caleb's death and she's outside and she, like, they're blaming her and their mom's like, get out, and she runs out to the tree, and then her father is there and he takes her in his arms and he's trying to comfort her, like, this tree will be so beautiful in spring, and you're like, this is him trying to be a good father. But then the scene subverts because he raises the possibility that he actually does believe she is the witch. And the idea that, like, because he approaches it like, oh, it's not too late, you can still repent, we can bring you, but that's a breaking moment for her, because she's just aghast that, like, in this moment, you're not that you would, like, offer comfort to your daughter, but the idea that you would be like, this is your fault, but that's okay, because I think I can help save you. And that's when she just breaks and snaps at him like, you can't save any of us. You can't hunt, you can't farm, you can't protect us, and now you're blaming me for all of this. And then he snaps and breaks, and that's why when he walks her and his other children in the woodshed with the devil goat, which you're like, that was a mistake. But even then, he gets one last moment of sympathy where you see him outside in, chopping wood yet again. And that's when he turns his head to the sky and is basically, he finally owns up to it. It's like, God, this is all my fault. I know I'm a prideful man. Do with me what you will, but please spare my children. And we see Thomason watching him through the slit boards in the barn, and there are tears in her eyes. And you're almost framed as what could be a moment of reconciliation. But by then, the rod is too big. And of course, the witch shows up. She drinks the milk from the nanny goat. She terrifies the kids. William wakes up. The goats are eviscerated. The barn is destroyed. The twins are gone. And Thomason is there. And you can just see William, like, look at her. And of course, that's when Black Phillip is finally like, and now I get to kill you. So it's and like it's a heartbreaking sequence, because this man of faith, like, he could have believed his daughter in this moment, but he was finally broken, And once he admitted to the possibility that he thought that she might actually be the witch, like, that was the last straw. That was where he loses Thomason forever. And even if she may have forgiven him after that, the devil's like, can't allow that. He's got to die. And and then she has to kill her own mother, which is horrific because there's the dynamic where the mom is fully snapped at this point, and she's coming after Thomason, trying to strangle her. And Thomason is pleading with her, mom, don't do this. I love you. I love you. And the mom just does not care at that point. And Thomason has to kill her in self-defense. And she's just empty at that point. Like the scene where she stands up and she's covered in blood, and then she looks out to the woods, and then she goes back into the home and she drapes her parents' blanket over herself and then just lays her head down on the table. You're like, she is just so completely and utterly alone right now. And it's all blackness and darkness for her.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what I'm talking about when I'm like, when you think about this being her first film, and it just, you get to this point, you're like, God, holy shit! We've been on one hell of a journey with her, and we're not quite done yet. Yeah, I just love the thought that, yeah, but there's an interesting thing about the scene with William and her, in like, if he had believed her in that moment, would that have then changed the outcome? Would then maybe the devil not have been able to exert his power, if there had actually been like peace between them in that moment? Or does that division, does that enter the point of no return? And and just the fact that it is sort of like, again, like not in the moment while you're watching it, but it is sort of like darkly humorous, the idea that she's left, with no one in that moment, and her whole family's like, yeah, barrel of laughs, but I said darkly humorous, but it's so interesting to me the way that this movie has built up the entire time, Thomason being accused of so many things throughout this movie, of all these dark deeds of having lost Samuel, and of being the witch, and of tempting her brother, and all this stuff. And it's those accusations and all those things piled up on her that actually lead her to the path at the end of the movie. And if if she wasn't living in such a puritanical system with such a a rigid family, that that just it's all of this that leads to her eventually becoming a witch, and the fact that it wouldn't have happened if if she had been treated more kindly and with understanding. And so you get to the end of the movie, and it's like it feels like there's this inevitability to it that is simultaneously heartbreaking, but also like it's presented as sort of this darkly victorious moment for her at the end. And given everything we've seen, like it makes me feel so like strangely conflicted watching the end of this movie. But it's
It's a fascinating dynamic because Guilty Undertaker's having some great points here in the chat about was Black Phillip killing William the devil's work or divine judgment or both? Satan as God's prosecutor, as he is in the Book of Job, which is also referenced several times in the film. And did Thomason escape the Puritan patriarchy, or was she consumed by it, or did she trade one patriarchy for another? Thank you, Guilty Undertaker, for all those points because they're fascinating discussion points. And just to take them from the first one, it's a great question because, certain religions have certain dynamics of how the interplay between God and the devil. Because the idea that if God is truly all powerful and Satan is one of his fallen angels, then why does God let him run around the world and do all these terrible things? When he could just, save people from him. And that raises the question, well, is Satan still, even though he is fallen, God's agent in many of these ways? Is he like a tool that God uses to test characters' faith? And it's particularly notable for characters in this religious paradigm of Calvinism in puritanical society, because a lot of these kind of Protestant religions in this era believe in the idea of predestination, that certain people are just like, they split out of the Catholic faith because there was the whole idea of, you do good works and then you go to heaven. And then people are like, well, when are these good works enough? And obviously I'm distilling European history down to a very bite-sized reductive thing. But the idea that these religions split off, and the fundamental idea was certain people are always going to go to heaven because they're just inherently good people, and then certain people are going to be damned because they are not, and that destiny's been predetermined. And so is that going to, and I apologize if I'm being like overly simplistic with the characterization, but just in the idea of the predestination complex, did this always need to happen to Thomason is the reason that we bring this up. Because if Thomason was always destined for the devil, if she was always destined for hell, then we don't like to believe that, because that means she had no choice in this matter and she is a pure victim. We want to believe that, terrible as this to say, by the end of the movie, she has claimed some kind of agency by finally casting off the shackles of this society that treated her so terribly and embracing a new belief system that gives her freedom. But she also, if we have subscribed to that, signed her soul over to the devil. Another, as Guilty Undertaker says, trading one patriarchy for another. And for earthly pleasures, for the taste of butter, a pretty dress, and the possibility of living deliciously. But was that always her destiny? That really goes to the idea of whether or not you think, as Guilty Undertaker points out, that Satan is doing God's work here, or if God is not answering these prayers and Satan is acting on his own agency and Thomason enters into this accord with him freely. And these are questions that the movie deliberately does not answer, because it's much more effective to torment us with those kind of horrifying possibilities rather than, give us the straight answer on that front.
Well, going back to my earlier, the last thing I expected to run into this conversation was talking about the TV show Lucifer. But of course, the really fun thing about that character, and I'm assuming I don't know if this is the case in Neil Gaiman's original graphic novels or not, but and it's not just, obviously not just that version of the character, but this concept of the devil as someone who punishes the wicked, but doesn't actually get anybody to do anything. And of course, the character in the TV show is like, hey, everybody's always mad at me. I never tell humanity to do anything. I just punish them for their wicked deeds. And so yeah, it's interesting to ponder that, but yeah, just like, I mentioned earlier, I love the ambiguity in so much of this film. I'm gonna just read real quick that final exchange. Black Phillip, I conjure thee to speak to me. Speak as thou dost speak to Jonas and Mercy. Dost thou understand my English tongue? Answer me. What dost thou want? What canst thou give? Wouldst thou like the taste of butter? A pretty dress? Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? Yes. Wouldst thou like to see the world? What will you from me? Dost thou see a book before thee? Remove thy shift. I cannot write my name. I will guide thy hand. And then cut. Straight cut with that pounding, bit of music to her walking into the woods.
Again, though, like Thomason up until this point, just go back to when she thought that Kayla might have seen an apple tree in the wood. And she's like, oh, I haven't had apples since England. I can't even remember what that's like anymore. So even just the whole concept of butter, I'm sorry, as banal as it sounds, was probably just like, that's actually salivating. And like, yes, I do want butter. Is it a carb, by the way? But I do want butter, and I do want pretty dresses. And at this point in time, you've pretty much, not pretty much, you have eliminated the rest of my family. What's left for me now? This, in her mind, probably seems like the best option in front of her at this moment in time. And just going off of what Eric says, because I think he's posited a lot of really great questions at the end of this conversation. She has nothing left. So in her mind, yeah, what else is there for me? My family's dead. I can't return to the village. They probably would never take me back. This dude's offering me butter and pretty clothes. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal. I'm going to sign on the dotted line, have at it. And then she goes off into the woods, and just the laugh at the end of it is just also spectacular, and her facial expressions. But it's just, in her mind, she's going to live her best life. But she's going to do her at this moment in time. And I don't know. Can we falter for it? Probably not. Like, it's just,
at that point, like, you don't really have there's like, what are the alternatives on the plate? And
butter, again, butter,
yeah.
Pretty clothes, immortality, pleasure.
Yeah.
Give up your eternal soul.
Yeah. It's a question that, we raise the prospect because the idea of consigning your soul to hellfire seems like, it's meant to be the worst thing you could possibly do. But clearly Thomason's life has been pretty freaking horrible, especially in the past, couple of weeks, as she has lost everyone who she ever loved and been effectively abandoned and left alone. And so the prospect of earthly pleasures and a new community is not only like the option that she needs at this moment to ensure her own survival. It's something that she seems ambivalent about it, but she's not. But she doesn't like. She's not crying when she makes the deal with the devil. She seems to have accepted that if this is what the world wants from me, or this is what the world is offering me, then I will take it. And she makes that bargain willingly. She goes into the woods willingly, and she joins the coven of witches dancing around the fire willingly. She becomes, as she once spoke in jest to her younger sister Mercy, I be the witch of the wood. And what Eric says in the chat, were there once other witches once like Thomason? yes, we see them at the end. It may not have been this exact story, but I think every single one of those women probably had a story that was not so different from Thomason's, being cast out in some form or another from their society and finding new, finding a pact with the devil, which is not meant to be a good thing, but also finding community in a strange way with each other. And that scene at the end where they're dancing in, like, they welcome her, and then there's pure ecstasy on their faces as they start to levitate, and then Thomason is laughing and she's crying, and then the laugh becomes more and more and more like maniacal, and she just starts to literally and figuratively ascend, and the final shot of the movie is literally her hanging in the air, arms outstretched in a literal Christ pose, hanging out in the, above the tree line, calling back to the idea, when her brother was dying, he threw out his arms and his head was back. That was Christ imagery as well. And that we're meant to believe he went to heaven, I think. And Thomason here has effectively consigned herself to hell, but she's just elated. And the movie ends on that shot where she's ascended up to the top of the trees above the fire. And you're like, this is what the world made her, but now she has embraced it. She is the Witch of the Wood.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting that, consigned herself to hell, but she's still ascending towards the heavens. Yeah. So, yeah, that imagery is just awesome, and just such a trippy way to end the movie. I don't know what expression I was making when this movie ended, but I was just like, oh God, yeah, just absolutely incredible. And I just the way that this movie ends, and it's very interesting because so again, me making references to other things, but the imagery of the witches around the fire and stuff, it very much reminded me of some imagery in the television show Outlander, when they're not literal witches, but they're referred to as kind of witches by in the society, of dancing around the standing stones that are such a crucial part of that show. And of course, the main character, once she goes back into the past, is called a witch by many people. And so I just can't help but think of those connections. And then in that light, you're kind of like, okay, if we ignore the grinding up of the babies, this is a very empowering and which it still is, but it's just, very twisted. But if there's one thing you should take away from the stream, ladies and gentlemen, it's that John is okay with child murder.
I thought we talked you off that ledge. Are you back on there?
Wow, I thought that was 20 minutes in that we had that addressed. But okay, here we are. So strap in, folks, because we're going to need another 60 minutes to talk John off the child murder ledge, apparently.
Stay tuned. This stream is probably going to get flagged now. And
I do not endorse this. This is entirely a you thing.
Yeah. This reminded me of something else. Something that one of the games we were playing at one of the conventions. I can't remember exactly what it was that I said, but it kind of took you guys aback. We'll save that reminiscing for another time. But anyway, moving on from that comment. I honestly don't know where to go from there. You guys take over.
This movie is dark. This stream was dark. It is what it is. Yes. That comment. Okay, yep. Thank you, Eric. No one at Joe condones that, but
The views expressed here are not the viewpoint of Cinematic Realms.
I should probably go ahead and make it clear that this was a joke.
Yeah, we know. It's we're
no,
this is a very very bleak movie, and the movie itself like lets you know from the beginning that it will be dealing with incredibly dark subject matter, because not every movie has the courage to tackle subject matter like this, with involving the death of children. And but the reason it's effective is the movie does not do so flippantly. It's doing it to tell a story of horror, and it's specifically the story of darkness within humanity itself, because ultimately that is what's at the heart of this story. It's the devil is at work here, literally, through the means of the witch, but this is ultimately a story about how a family is destroyed in the wilderness by forces from within and without. And the within is a critical part of that, because if the family had managed to remain united, they may have been able to repel this evil that consumed them. But the fractures that opened were just too wide, and it consumed them. And that's a part of the essential human tragedy as well. And the movie depicts that very, very well, because it's the kind of thing that we don't like to reckon with. That's why it's horrific to us. But it's also a beautifully told story in its way, because it is a story that everyone can relate to in that kind of typical sense of, these are the things that are the most base fears at the base of our like primitive skull, and these primal ideas are what sends the literal chill down our spine as we watch the movie.
Yeah, I was thinking as I was watching this that and I wasn't raised super religious. I did go to a Sunday school when I was little. And my parents tried to instill every Sunday go to church for a little while, but then I think my dad was like, he was like, I'm not doing this every Sunday. So it's so it hasn't been like a huge part of my life, but it's amazing kind of watching this. That I think some of that stuff, I guess, depending on who you are, it never completely leaves you, if that's been sort of part of how you were brought up. And I was just watching this and, feeling that sort of inherent fear of like returning of like, oh God, is this the kind of horrible stuff that awaits those of us who are sinners. And it's, so I think it does tap into those primal fears that a lot of us have, and it's all the more like terrifying because of that. And I'll say what I said. I can't remember if I said it on the stream or before we started talking. I probably did say it at the beginning of the stream, but like I watched this, today in broad daylight with the lights on, and it still scared the shit out of me. So I think that's the power of this movie, and I don't want it to seem like it's just because it has, the scares and the terror, and as we've been talking about, this is an extraordinarily interesting film with multi-layered characters. Even I was joking before about even as I was joking about characters like Mercy and oh God, who's the other kid? Jonas. Yeah. Like what befalls them and the rest of the family is just so tragic, and it's watching it it's just a harrowing experience, and because there's so much that's left ambiguous about the nature of the characters. We don't know about everything that led them up to this moment. We have thoughts about whether they kind of brought some of this on themselves and all that, but we're really left with these sort of thought-provoking questions of these characters, and we meet them in the moment that we meet them in, and it's just so interesting to watch them ponder these questions moment to moment. Just a scene like we talked about earlier between Caleb and William, just talking about going to hell and death and all that. We can criticize William for the way he deals with that, but it's such, like so many scenes in this movie, it's so interesting to watch that from a character perspective, and just to see the way that he sort of processes his dealing with his faith and how he views the world, and and then passing that on to a child and how that child processes it. And so this movie is just so compelling from a character standpoint, with the family drama that we see. And it's interesting to me, Jared, that you did say that this turned into less of an ensemble and more focused on Thomason, because I still feel like this is an incredibly strong ensemble piece, where obviously she's the focal point, and especially with the way the film builds towards its end, but this just feels like such a family drama set in this horrific situation they all find themselves in. I love the way it's constructed, and Laura, I can't thank you enough for introducing me to this movie, because like I said before, not only did I like it, I freaking loved it, and it's actually turned into one of those movies that I'd point to that and be like, that's a classic right there, and it's I'm never gonna it's one of those movies that'll never leave my thoughts. I'll always be thinking about how how freaked out I was the first time I saw it, and just so incredibly well made, and I'm very happy to have seen it.
Well, I live to give you nightmare fuel and perpetuate, just good, horrific cinematic quality. So you're welcome.
So yeah, I think we're wrapping up. You got any final comments, Jared?
I want to shout out a couple of the crafts people who worked on this movie, because for the fact that this movie was a first feature made for a budget of less than $4 million, it looks incredible, and that's because of the specificity of the crafts. First and foremost, Jaron Blaschke is the cinematographer. He and Robert Eggers are good friends. Jaron Blaschke has done the cinematography on all of Robert Eggers' features so far. He did this movie. He did The Lighthouse, for which he was nominated for an Oscar for cinematography. He did The Northman. And he's doing Robert Eggers' next feature, Nosferatu, which comes out this December, which I'm very excited for. And then the production designer, Craig Lathrop. I mentioned that Robert Eggers has a very specific background. He started as a production designer, and he had a very specific idea of wanting it to feel so authentic. So Craig Lathrop helped him realize that vision. The costume designer, Linda Muir. Anya Taylor Joy has talked about how effective, getting into those costumes was into helping her, get into the mindset of the time period. And then the score by Mark Korven, as you mentioned, just in incredibly effective use of, chorus and droning and all these sounds that are just by very nature unsettling to us.
The strings reminded me very much of whatever the F is going on in the There Will Be Blood score. of like just setting you on edge.
Yeah, it's brilliantly. It's a brilliant type of score for this movie, even if it's perhaps not what you would necessarily expect. But really, what I just want to kind of conclude on is the idea of this is one of my all-time favorite horror movies, and frankly, it's climbing up the list of just my all-time favorite movies in general. And when I think about other horror movies that I truly love, movies like Alien, like The Shining, like Let the Right One In, and like it's all just these like this atmosphere and tone that manages to capture a very specific unsettling atmospheric quality that also emphasizes archetypal storytelling and sets like humanity against these forces that just seem too great to overcome. That's the type of horror that I like. And the fact that this movie, I can count the number of jump scares in it on one hand, but every single one of them works for me. That's just a testament to the way the entire movie is crafted. And I think I remember when we talked about this movie in the mid-roll last week, someone, I believe it may have been Eric in the chat actually, or actually it was 8984M, I'm sorry. They mentioned that the movie is wood scary, which I actually think is perfectly accurate because that's one of the most archetypical fears of them all, being lost in the dark woods. As someone who grew up in Connecticut, that was a very specific type of fear that I had as well. But the idea of when I think about this movie, I really think about two very popular and evocative phrases and why it's so effective. I think about the idea of, if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, does it make a sound? And perhaps the best movie tagline ever, the tagline for Alien, in space, no one can hear you scream. In the woods, if unspeakable horrors are happening, but no one else is around, are they really happening? And if you scream and cry out and no one can hear you, like, how do you save yourself? And then the answer in this movie is you can't. And that's one of the reasons why it's so terrifying to me. And why I am just so extraordinarily impressed with what Robert Eggers and Anya Taylor Joy and Ralph Ineson and Kate Dickie and the entire cast and all the craftsmen created here, because this is one of the best horror movies ever. And just no one would have predicted that based on the premise, based on, the budget they had for it. But they found something here that just will live on, hopefully, for years to come. I still think this is Robert Eggers' best movie, and he is one of my favorite working directors, and I just can't wait to see what he's doing next. And Anya Taylor Joy's star is ascendant, but I'll never forget that she started here with one of the best debut film performances I've ever seen. So very, very happy with this movie, as you can tell.
Close us out, Laura. What are your final thoughts?
Enjoy your butter, enjoy your fancy clothes, and live life deliciously, folks. You only get one. So YOLO with butter and pretty dresses.
All right. Well, we did better. 2.5 hours. At least we didn't take you to 3, Laura.
I knew what I signed up for.
Okay, so just quickly saying again, next week will be on Saturday instead of Sunday. We'll be talking about Dune Part 2. Looking forward to that. And then the next, and then Sunday is Oscar night, so we'll actually be having fun in the Here Be Dryden Slack. So join us for a watch party. And then in the next couple weeks, we'll be talking about Sense and Sensibility, and then Batman Master of the Phantasm. So looking forward to that.
Sense and Sensibility will be our palate cleanser after talking about religious fundamentalism for the 2 straight weeks with this movie and Dune Part 2.
Well, and we were talking about really switching it up, and at first we were going to do Batman: Mask of the Phantasm after Dune, and I was feeling, and you concurred, that like it's not enough of a, you know, of a left turn. We've got to go like stronger in another direction. So sensibility it is, and I can't wait to talk about that because you know, we've talked about a lot of period, you know, romance dramas that star a certain actress, Keira Knightley, but I think this will be one of our first times venturing, you know, into the genre outside of her casting. And we'll be appreciating the wonderful Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet, Hugh Grant. You know, I can't wait. It's one of my mom's favorite movies, and I can't wait to talk about that because especially towards the end of the movie, there's a part that always just made her like tear up, and so we'll very much be talking about that, and yeah. So that's it, and I won't belabor this any longer, so we can go ahead and get out of here. So next week, Saturday instead of Sunday, and it'll be about Dune Part 2. All right, guys, thank you for tuning in. Thank you again, Laura, for joining us. I felt like this was a long time coming, and I had a lot of fun talking about this with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so glad that you invited me on. I was thrilled to talk to you about this film, and just, you know, glad that you finally saw it, and just it's nice to have a convo with you and Jared about it. So I'm here for it.
And again, I'm very sad that Trish wasn't able to join us. But you know what, Jared? This means we were talking about maybe abusing our relationship with Trish by having her on too many times. But this means we can rope her in for something else.
Yeah, no, we have a lot of movies that Trish has also expressed interest in talking about as well. So hopefully she'll be able to join us next time, and we hope that she feels better. And we will welcome that opportunity when it arises.
Yep.
And you too, Laura, whenever you want to come back.
Yeah.
Yep. I hate movies, so never again. Never. No, I'm always down. So you know where to find me.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, once again for tuning in. I hope you guys have a wonderful night, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Take care.